And just a little bit about me, I am a community advocate. I currently serve as the Advocacy Director at Alliance for Girls, which is a nonprofit. So I do policy advocacy for my full-time job. I'll be going to grad school next month to study public policy as well. And I'm also an appointed commissioner on the Alameda County Women's Commission. So that's kind of my background and what I bring today. And feel free to pause at any point if you have questions or you want to raise anything. I think everyone here has a lot of experience and knowledge with advocacy in different forms, as you'll come to know. So I want to hear from you all too about what you think and just have all the knowledge that we have in this room here today. So first, we will go over what is racism, and I would love for someone to read the definition. So any volunteers?
What is racism? A socially constructed system of oppression that is rooted in anti-blackness. It manifests in the dehumanization of people of color, abuse, and genocide, and is based on a hierarchy that informs structures of power among all racial/ethnic groups.
The practice and underlying belief that Blackness, its history and rich culture is something to be denied, belittled, oppressed, and hated. It is both systemic as part of policies and institutions, as well as interpersonal as we have seen in cases of bias and discrimination.
Who's heard of the term anti-Blackness? Anyone familiar with it? See a few hands. Yeah. I feel like during the pandemic, that was a very critical conversation that we had as a country. Not a new conversation, but I think the pandemic really forced everyone to pay attention and focus on that. So when we talk about these issues, part of why I bring it up is because the way that anti-Blackness and racism show up is in the cycle of oppression. All of us are inherently impacted by racism in one way or another, and whether we're benefiting from it or we're being impacted by it directly. And so it's important for us to understand this when we're doing advocacy and organizing, so that we can have that lens and framework when we're approaching key issues, and also be mindful of our own positionalities, right, and how we're coming into this space. So the cycle of oppression here kind of helps us understand how does this continue to perpetuate in a circle, and then when we understand that cycle, we can also understand how do we break that cycle. So this is kind of the cycle here as it in a circle kind of space. And I'll go back to the previous slide because it has some of the definitions of the terminology that you're seeing. But you can see the circle here that starts with stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, institutionalization, and internalization. So going back, I just want to make sure we have the definitions, right? When we're talking about oppression, we're referring to policies, practices, and norms that systemically exploit one social group by another for the dominant group's benefit. So that's just broadly speaking to oppression, and oppression is something that we can see within the context of gender-based violence, racism, ableism, and other forms of discrimination. And so when you see the cycle and the way that it kind of goes in a circle, and now thinking of how do we break it, it starts with a stereotype. And so we often have a fixed image or traits widely believed to represent all members of a particular community. We're all familiar with stereotypes, unfortunately, about Muslims, right? Muslims are terrorists. Those are an example of a stereotype, right? It's not true, but it is a widely fixed image that people believe to be true. Prejudice is a preconceived opinion or attitude that is not based on reason or actual experience, and it's often connected to someone's perceived identity. I say perceived identity and emphasize that because people often make assumptions, right? You see someone on the street, and we've seen this a lot with our Sikh community, right? When someone sees a Sikh person, thinks, oh, that person is Muslim. It's their perceived identity, right? That person's not actually Muslim, but as a result of that, they're going to direct their prejudice towards that person, even though it's not based on any real fact or real experience. And then discrimination is an action or practice that excludes or disadvantages an individual or group based on perceived identity. So this is now someone's actually taking, action towards something, right? There can be something that you internally believe, but then acting on it is when we see different forms of discrimination. And then institutionalization is when we see how these practices and beliefs are actually embedded within systems, right? Within structures of government, of local leadership within organizations and organizational cultures, and actually changes, impacts outcomes and policies for communities and for people. And then finally, you see the cycle ends with internalization, which is to accept and embody a norm, value, attitude, or behavior established and reinforced by cultures and institutions through socialization, active learning, or unconscious assimilation. So at that point, we have prejudice. There's a stereotype, a fixed image that's been reinforced through media or through other forms of culture. It then becomes something that we may act upon through discrimination, whether conscious or unconscious. It gets adopted by institutions and local governments, and we see it show up in policies. It's actually impacting people. And then the internalization is when we see that and we think, oh, that's normal, right? This is what it is. Because everything around us is reinforcing that this is normal and this is acceptable. So we see this show up for many communities, right? And we're going to be talking about this, within the focus of anti-Black racism and how we see that show up in our own communities, right? Because especially, in the South Asian community and in non-Black people of color communities, right? Which I think is important to highlight. We're not exempt from anti-Black racism. We're not exempt from being racist, whether it's within our own communities or to other communities. And so we have to take that moment to pause and reflect and look internally. One of the ayahs from the Qur'an talks about, stand firm in justice, be it against yourselves or your parents. And I think that's really profound because it's asking us to look internally and think about how are we ourselves perpetuating injustice and how do we address that internally and then within our family and our immediate community. So that's why it's really important for us to have that conversation and really think about that. I think often in this country, the conversation is very black and white. There's not so much conversation on what about the people in the middle, right? You're not Black, you're not white, but you're still involved in this situation, right? We still have we have a history of South Asians and non-Black people of color perpetuating racism. And then there's also a history of non-Black people of color actively being comrades, right? Standing in allyship. We see people like Yuri Kochiyama or Grace Lee Boggs. And I would also recommend all of you check out the Berkeley South Asian Radical History Walking Tour, like kind of learn more about the history of South Asian activism. But I bring that up to say, like, we are also part of this, and that's why we need to pay attention. So when we think about this cycle, right, this is something that, at one point I would love for us to reflect on, how do we break this cycle and what's keeping us in this cycle, right? How do we actually stop this perpetual cycle of oppression? And so that also transitions into, right, like, what is our role? How do we actively address this issue? And what does that look like? So allyship is a concept that you may have heard of. If you have, raise your hand. How many of you are familiar? Allyship? Yes, I see some of you. And so allyship is something that allows us to really think of how are we standing in solidarity with another community. And it's not a term that, like, we self-proclaim, right? I don't show up like, hi, I'm an ally, right? We don't do that. But it's how do we show up through our actions, through our words, through our intentions for another community, and be able to show up in solidarity, take the leadership of another community when addressing an issue. So there are some reflection questions, around, like, what does allyship mean to you and what are some words that come to mind when you think of an ally? So I'm sure all of us can even share examples of times where someone has been an ally to us, right? As Muslims, we often face discrimination or Islamophobia, and there may have been times where, whether it was in the news or you personally, someone came to support you and be your ally. So I would love to kind of get a sense of examples if anybody has any, whether it's your personal life or just something that you saw in your community.
So I think for me, allyship is kind of like, throughout our lives, most of us might have experienced like discrimination or Islamophobia sometimes. So at some point in our lives, I think I remember one time when one of my friends, and that too, one of my close friends kind of got into that path of like believing Muslim stereotypes and kind of started judging me for being a Muslim. And so just seeing my other friends, even though they were non-Muslim, stand up for me and, just like help me feel better and kind of explain to our other friend that, that's not how it is. I think that could kind of be considered allyship.
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
example. Thank you for sharing, and I'm sorry you went through that.
That's okay.
I'm glad you have friends that were allies, right? That they, without you having to say anything, were able to say, let's step up and do something about it. You want to share what it maybe just attributes of a good ally?
Okay, so I guess some good attributes are like they come to your help when you're like in trouble and with like out asking, and then maybe like they check up on you and like see how you're doing, and if you need help, then yeah.
Yeah, that's great. The follow-up, right? You're making sure that you're actually asking the person, you good? Because it's at the end of the day about the person, right, who's impacted.
I think the most important attribute of an ally should be the fact that they've been through what you've been through. Like they kind of empathy for you because they've been in your shoes. So that's like they can comfort you better if it's like relatable, right?
Yeah, being able to relate to like the human experience and the human emotions. And we got one more behind you.
And also, I mean, if you're trying to help someone out who's facing discrimination or and you haven't necessarily faced their exact kind of discrimination, or you're not from that ethnic group or what have you, humility is incredibly important, because a lot of the time people will sort of take the struggles of other groups and act as though they're like the savior of this group or something like this, right? So I think humility is the thing that I'd say is most important now.
That's great. I really like that one because it's reminding us, right? Even if we don't have the same exact experience, we're not coming in to say, oh, I'm saving someone. At the end of the day, it's about how does a person who is most impacted, how are they feeling, right? And so when I think of allyship, I think of, okay, how are we taking leadership from the people who are from the impacted community? How are we receiving feedback? You know, are we hearing when they tell us, that wasn't the best way, Haleema, like you should have done it a different way, or can you actually do this, right? Am I actually listening to that and being humble about taking that in? So those are great. I would say, you know, allyship is an ongoing process, not something that at any point we say, like, oh, we did the thing, I'm an ally, you know, I'm going to pat myself on the back. And, you know, in the context of anti-Black racism, I want us to really think of how do we prioritize taking leadership from Black communities, prioritize the calls to action that they're asking us to do, right? And during these last couple of years, the calls to action for defunding the police and abolishing the police have continued to increase, right? So that's a call to action that we have to think of. How are we supporting that? Maybe it's me educating myself on what does defunding the police mean, right? And then looking into locally, what are ways that I can support that? That's one example. I think it also requires us to think of shifting power dynamics. As people who are not Black, we hold a certain level of privilege. And so when we're stepping into how do we address an issue that we're inherently benefiting from, whether or not we want to or not, we have to think of what are we willing to give up, right? There's going to be times where we have to shift power. How am I giving power back? And what am I willing to do for things to happen? There might be times where in solidarity with another person, you know, I was asked to actually speak at an event with another person, and we were both being paid to speak at this event. And the other person was censored and removed from the event because of her support for Palestine. And so in solidarity, I said, I'm not speaking either. And the sacrifice was I didn't get paid, right? But I was willing to make that sacrifice. So knowing what you're willing to sacrifice is important because there's going to be moments where you're going to have to make that decision. I think it also just, you know, just thinking of power dynamics, right? When are opportunities where we can say, oh, I was being asked to do this, or someone gave me this power, they gave me the mic, but I'm going to pass the mic to the impacted community. I'm going to give that power to someone else. So really thinking of how we're able to shift those dynamics. Donating your time, right? This is something that all of us can do, especially during the pandemic, right? When we have a little bit more time back, hopefully, being able to support community organizations through whatever skills you have. And it sounds like all of you have some great skills, right? Baking, having a book club, doing painting, doing, you know, all kinds of stuff. These are all ways to either fundraise or create community spaces where we can educate ourselves and each other. And so all of us have the power to do something, right, at a local level. And then being open to taking the feedback. It can be really hard, right, as humans when someone gives us feedback and says, you didn't do that right, or, you know, this didn't land well. And especially when we have good intentions, but we have to be willing to take that without getting defensive, and take that as a gift. I personally see that as a gift, right? If someone comes to me and says, your impact, Haleema, wasn't, it didn't land well for me, this hurt my feelings, or this caused some harm, being able to take that in because someone actually took the time to be brave and tell me this, right? It's not easy to give that feedback. So being able to take that feedback as a gift and to be able to think of, how do I reflect on that and improve myself? And then finally thinking of like, where do we best fit in, right? All of us have very different roles that we can play. And when we close out, we'll talk about the different kinds of roles in social change and advocacy and organizing, and also thinking of like, where do you feel like you best align, right? Each of us have a very unique set of skills and gifts and talents. How do we best use that for making social change? So let's see, I think we kind of already talked about this, so I'm going to skip to the different ways of making social change. And you all also have some of this information kind of written in your packets or your handouts, so you should be able to kind of look through that there. But there's a couple of different ways that you can make social change, and I would love to hear from all of you too as we go through this, if you have experience with any of these different models, whether you've been involved or you've benefited from them. The first one is direct service. And direct service is, when we're able to get a service from someone, maybe it's I'm going to a legal clinic because I need help figuring out some paperwork with a lawyer. Maybe I'm going to get a COVID-19 vaccine or get a COVID-19 test, right? That's a direct service that's being provided by community organizations, governments, and other individuals. So we're just getting that one-on-one service. And in this model or in this structure, we're not really looking to change the system. We're looking to provide someone with a solution, some kind of immediate relief, right? How do I provide you with some help now, right? With recognition that there might be changes on the larger level that need to be made. But right now, this person needs housing. So how do we get them housing? Or this person needs to get the vaccine now, even if they don't have insurance, let's get them their vaccine. So direct service is really looking at how do we provide that immediate service. CAIR is a great example, right? They're providing direct service by making sure they're providing legal aid and support for people, right? And then self-help, that's one where someone individually seeks out, I need help, I need to figure this out, and I'm gonna find my own path to do that. How many of you have tried the self-help avenue? Maybe it was, you need a tutor, or you need extra resources for your class, and you're like, I'm gonna seek it out myself. I will go on the internet and find something, right? We've all been there. Education. So this is one way that we can start to go into the more in the spectrum of how do we change something, right? Whether it's educating ourselves or educating others, but it is really trying to get more information. It can look like raising awareness, right? We've seen awareness campaigns, education campaigns, addressing like, for example, let's talk about the narrative about Muslims in this country, right? That's like an education or awareness campaign effort that's trying to shift the power, shift the stereotypes, shift prejudice, and hopefully be able to address the ways that these get institutionalized in policies and practices. And then you have advocacy. And this can look like CAIR's advocacy day at the Capitol, right? When we're all going and advocating for certain bills and telling our elected officials, these are the things that we care about. These are the bills and policies that we need you to pass and support. Advocacy can also look like you advocating for your sister or your brother to go, maybe you're like, we all need boba and parents are not taking us to it. We're going to advocate together for each other to go get this thing, right? And then finally, you have organizing, which is really looking at direct action. And that's, on the other end of the spectrum, we're really looking to shift things. So we're saying as a community, we've decided that we're going to organize to shift a policy and to make systemic change so that this issue no longer keeps happening, right? So we're trying to get to the root cause of the problem. Any questions about this continuum of social change or things that people want to add? We have just in the room. But yes, here, this kind of goes over what I just mentioned, direct service, we have self-help, education, let's see, advocacy. Who remembers Hassan Minhaj testifying? I love when he testifies. It's always so funny and so on point. And then you have organizing. This is a group that I really would recommend people check out. It's a great way to get involved. It's called ASATA. It's the Alliance of South Asians Taking Action. They've been around for a long time, and they do a lot of great solidarity work with other communities. So I would highly recommend them. So we'll go into the activity now. So could I have somebody read the statistic on the slide?
White students are 1.3 times more likely than black students to be enrolled in AP classes, and white students are 1.7 times more likely than black students to be enrolled in gifted programs.
Thank you for reading that. I want to show a quick video. I'm just double checking that we have sound when we share this.
The mold, the carpet, the walls itself, the classrooms, the teachers, everything that you need in the school or could use in the school is not there. At this point, it's just like a daycare for teenagers.
Students at Block High School in rural Louisiana say conditions at their school are so bad that they're struggling to get an education.
As you can see right here, if you look closely, it got some the water that's been leaking. That's turning to mold. Like when you go in the classrooms, you can smell it.
That building there, B building, it is completely unsafe, but we still do go in there as far as using the auditorium.
These are the textbooks they were given at the beginning of the school year.
Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like.
Teachers across the country continue to go on strike, but public education in rural areas gets little national attention. We traveled to Catahoula Parish, Louisiana, one of the poorest parishes, one of the poorest states in the country, to see why students are speaking out and what conditions in Deep South schools are like more than 6 decades after desegregation.
They try to make you a world history teacher, geography teacher, and a
ACT prep.
And a standardized test prep teacher. And are you certified for any of that?
I'm only certified in physical education.
Their athletic coach, Benny Volt, inspired his students to speak out.
I taught history for a little while. I taught the amendments. And you know, the First Amendment, you have the right to protest.
They made you teach history, so you said, okay, I'll teach them history. I'll teach them the history of protest.
I teach the history of protest.
Coverage tonight of the protests at Block High School.
We got teachers that are not certified teaching subjects that they don't even know.
If you're a teacher and you don't know what you're doing, how you expect me to do.
Block High School is situated in Jonesville, the poorest section of Catahoula Parish. Nearly 70% of seniors are black, and about 60% of students here do not go on to college after graduation. But 13 miles away, there's another school in the same school district that looks a lot different. Nearly 90% of the senior class here is white. They perform better academically and enroll in college at a higher rate.
So we just tried to film inside Harrisonburg High School, but the superintendent won't let our cameras inside. They don't want the principals to talk to us on camera. But there's a clear, notable difference in how the school looks compared to Block High School.
Dr. Gilly Freeman is in charge of all schools in the district, including Block and Harrisonburg High School.
When we talk to students and we talk to families at Block High School, they compare it to Harrisonburg. They say Harrisonburg has beautiful facilities. Why do you think they're saying there's such a difference?
Several of the other schools, communities have passed bond issues specifically around facility renovation and refurbishment, and in the recent years, Jonesville hasn't passed any such issue to address their schools.
Freeman says that the state of Louisiana gives a set amount of money to school districts, but individual towns can raise additional money by issuing a bond or a tax.
What this has allowed them to do is to create inside a single school district high schools that are really inequitable in terms of their funding when it comes to facility maintenance, in a way that creates schools that are economically segregated and racially segregated.
Belinda Davis is a public policy professor and education advocate at Louisiana State University. We showed her video from inside Block High School.
The entire school board of Catahoula Parish ought to be ashamed that they have a school in that district that is in that kind of shape.
Do you think it's fair the system as it is right now?
Well, that's a perception issue. Overall funding for public education for our district has reduced over the period of time. The demographics and the population of our parish has decreased, and quite frankly because of economic conditions, a lack of business in the industry.
So I'll pause there because the video is 7 minutes long and I want to be mindful of time. But just looking at this video, right, we're able to see some examples going back to the cycle of oppression, right, of institutionalization, of prejudice, of stereotypes, and how these are manifesting into outcomes. So I had a few reflection questions, for you all to kind of think about. I would love for you to do that in pairs or in groups of 2 or 3. So find the people sitting next to you and think about, how do you think the lack of resources impacts student perception of themselves? How does what you saw in the video and the above statistic, which is listed here, impact the long-term academic trajectory for Black students? And I won't put the third one just for the sake of time. So just thinking of the first 2 questions. So find people sitting next to you, and we'll take about 2 minutes, just do a quick discussion. And then I would love to hear from like a couple of people. All right, we'll bring it back to the front. As long as there's some really good discussion.
We were just talking about how a lack of resources would actually make students feel like they weren't good enough, which is why they weren't being given these resources. And when you think you're not good enough, then you don't want to pursue higher education because you don't think you're fit for it. And with a lack of better facilities, you're not really getting an education, then you kind of think, what's the point of me going here?
Right, you're not being set up for success from the beginning. And it was really interesting in the video, right, how they talked about was how the lack of resources were being allocated, right? The district was getting one amount of money for for all the schools, but then there was this rule that said each school can add additional money if they can fundraise. So that was already kind of setting up this inequity. And if you look at how schools are funded here where we live, right, currently, it is based on property taxes. So that means automatically some schools will have more money and some schools will have less money. And so you can go miles apart and see a completely different outcome. Not because there was any fault of students, right, or if someone wasn't smart enough, but it's because the resources were not being allocated equitably. Can you hear for 1 more, 2 more people?
I think for the second one, I think if it starts off for Black students, if they start off having a low percentage of them actually graduating, and in the long term, there's most likely going to be just more and more and more people if it stays like this.
Right, so just thinking of what does that mean for the long term for that person if they're not getting a good education, then how that trickles into job opportunities, and then how that could trickle into generationally, right, the wealth they're able to accumulate or not accumulate. We're going to go to look at one more example before we do our case study. And so this statistic talks about kind of the school to prison pipeline. We see that Black youth make up only 15% of the total juvenile population, but 58% of youth in prisons. And so that's a huge difference, right? And seeing the ways that Black youth are criminalized and punished, and also seeing how that ties back into schools. So we'll go over 2 quick short videos.
This is what they call me in school. I was sent home because of how my hair looks.
Had a teacher cut my hair off for playing with my braids. Thrown to the floor for sitting at my desk.
Black girls are suspended 5 times more than white girls, but they don't commit more serious offenses.
Why is this happening?
I'm strong.
I'm sensitive.
I'm powerful.
I'm smart.
I'm a leader.
So I think those two videos give us a good example, right? If we're going back to the cycle of oppression, right? We saw how stereotypes, how individual prejudice can manifest into discrimination and institutionalization, as well as internalization, right? And so in these videos, we saw the ways in which a prejudice or a stereotype about Black students, Black youth, right? First, there's like the adultification of Black youth, where a Black youth is always seen as dangerous, as older than they actually are, aggressive. And those were all the things that the girls in the videos were talking about, right? And the ways in which they were punished and criminalized for it. You could also see in these videos the normalization of carceral language or pro-policing language, right? The ways that we have resource officers or police officers within schools, metal detectors, right? This is a place of education. However, it's being treated almost like it's a prison, or you're being prepared to be sent into a prison where it's like a training camp. And so there's this school to prison pipeline that shows up as a result of this cycle of oppression that we see. And so we'll have a quick discussion, for us to reflect on what came up for you when you watch these videos. And every time I watch these videos or, even think about this, it also reminds me of what are the things that I believe, right? Are these things that I was taught, and when did I learn these things? The stereotypes, right? And those are things that we are socialized in our own communities. So even reflecting on that, like, are these things that I believed or still believe? Thinking about, how school punishments have an impact on students' interest and students' success in school, right? If you're coming to school and you're seeing a police officer or a dog that's there to sniff out drugs or a metal detector, how likely you're going to feel like this is a place where I've come to learn, or I can feel safe or comfortable. And also, how do you feel like you would be perceived, right? And then what do you think schools could do to make all students feel more welcome in the classroom? And really thinking of how do we break that cycle? And this includes thinking of your own schools, right? Do you see these issues showing up in your schools in different ways, at different varying levels? Have you listened to the struggles or the concerns of Black students in your school? Most schools have Black student unions or clubs, right? Similar to how we have MSAs, right? Are you going into those spaces or just listening, right? Are they hosting events that maybe you haven't attended or checked out? And so even thinking of what can you do in your own classroom or your own school space. So I'll have you all kind of go back to your groups that you were in initially to discuss these questions, and we'll take about 3 minutes to do that.
Yeah, for like the third one, for how to make students feel more welcome, we said like a better environment and better resources, more funding. And the police officer thing, that was like, if you take that away, I think school environment could be better without like having to worry about like any small mistake you make, someone would just come and like, throw you out of your seat or something. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Seeing those videos is just so it was just so similar to what I've experienced. Because I actually lived in Chicago for about 2 years. Before that, I lived in Maryland. And it was like 90% white there, such good schools. Public school is literally like a private school. And in Chicago, we actually toured a public school because I've been going to public school my entire life. And when we walked in for the tour, it was like one of the better schools in the area. And there were metal detectors, which I'd never seen before. There was like a resource center near the entrance with police officers. And when we went in, they were like, we have 5 classes in every grade, and it goes by students' like ability, and like the dumber students were in one class, and then like all the way towards the end, it was like the smarter students. And apparently there was a uniform. You weren't allowed to wear like red or blue, you had to wear black and beige. And a lot of the students, if you didn't wear it, you would like get detention, or you'd have to talk to the resource officers because you might be in a gang. It was really weird. Really weird.
Right, so that's showing examples of how anti-Black racism, right, is showing up in spaces, and how schools are situated in certain ways, right? That school wasn't setting up students for success, it was setting them up to go into the school to prison pipeline, when you literally have police officers, resource officers, right? That's a reform system that we continue to see, where people are like, oh, well, we'll just call them resource officers, and we have those in Bay Area school districts. That's not something that's in some faraway land or like 50 years ago. That's happening today, right now, and it continues to happen. We continue to see incidents of discrimination, of violence happen in these spaces. And I want to now kind of transition and pivot us to really thinking of like, what do we do about it, right? This is happening in our own schools, in our own communities. And there's a high chance we're not aware that it's even happening because it doesn't impact us directly, right? It's not something that we're actually paying attention to. So one of the things that we need to do is to educate ourselves so that we can start to become more aware of what is happening in our community, right? And how are folks being impacted by these issues. But we're going to transition to kind of a case study, right? And we're all going to be able to practice how would we actually enact social change, you know, when we're seeing this happen in our own space. So for this case study, this is a scenario. You have attended your high school for the last 3 years, and the school board is deciding to implement a zero tolerance policy in the next month. There's a board meeting to discuss this new policy, and the meeting is open to students, parents, and community to give input. So a zero tolerance policy is basically like policies, if you're not familiar, where they are instead of saying like, oh, I'm going to give you a warning because you had an infraction or, you know, you did something wrong, it's just like, nope, that's it. We're going to go straight to detention, suspension, and have zero tolerance for any like missteps. And so this kind of policy has very racist roots and disproportionately targets Black students and results in higher rates of suspension, detention, and also kind of facilitates the school to prison pipeline. So we want to, as a community, show up and say, we don't support this policy and we want to address this issue. So we'll go to our social change models, right? We talked about direct service, we talked about self-help, education, advocacy, and organizing. Those are all tools at our disposal that we can use to start thinking of how would we address this issue in our local community. And there's a very high chance this kind of thing does exist in your school, so please treat it as a real scenario that you would be thinking about. So we'll go to I'll go to the next slide so you can see the different social change models. And in your groups, I want you to think about how do you want to show up as someone who's aiming to be an ally, right? We're trying to address this issue. We want to be in solidarity with another community, and also recognizing it's also not just Black students, although Black students are disproportionately impacted, but all students of color would be impacted by a policy like this. And so thinking of how would you want to show up to address this issue. And so I'll keep these kind of continuum of social change models up here so you can see kind of the descriptions over here and have that. But we will go into our groups. I'll give everyone about like 4 or 5 minutes, and we can go into thinking of like what would be the plan of action.
For advocacy, I said spread awareness in your community.
Right, trying to mobilize other people. Yeah. Great. How about the group right in front of you? The green and the blue shirts. Either of you want to share?
I did something kind of similar for advocacy. I also did like on social media, you can spread the word a lot and going to protests.
Yeah, using social media, showing up to organizing efforts. Nice. Let's hear from this side. Maybe 2 people. Yes, do you want to hear the front?
For self-help, I said like researching and using your own resources in order to provide like services for like yourself, so you can help yourself.
Yeah, almost like a know your rights and how do I deal with this if I'm impacted by the policy. And get one more. It could be for any of them, like the advocacy, organizing, education. I'll give you a minute to think about it, but it's important for us to all know, like, how do we impact social change? Because at one point or another, you know, you may not think you're going to ever use this, but you will in your life, because we all will have points where we need to address an issue in our community, something that's impacting us or others. And so having this ability to problem solve and strategize is really, really important. Even if it's something in life, you know, maybe you got a flat tire and you figure out, what do I do about this? And so these are really, it's a skill set, right? And we're trying to practice that skill set. It takes time, right, to practice that muscle. I dropped in a few examples here as well. Some of you already kind of shared some of those, but self-help, really thinking of like within the situation, how do we try to create some level of safety for students, for education, thinking about like how do we research the negative impacts that this issue has had and present some of that information to the school district and to the school level. Maybe that will help change the superintendent's perspective or the school board's perspective on this. Advocacy, right? Maybe we're going to meet with the administrators and talk to them about how this issue is impacting Black students and why we don't want it. And if that doesn't work, maybe we're going to show up and organize, right? We show up to the meeting in protest. We might hold a rally at the school. We might decide we're not coming to school today because we're going to be in solidarity with this, right? We've all seen walkouts as one strategy that students have used. And so those are all different ways, right, that we can impact social change in our communities. I think we're like getting pretty close to time, so I'm going to skip the break and I'm going to go into like, when we're thinking of organizing, right, like where do you start? Because it is such a big, like daunting task, right? There's so many pieces of it and you're going to be like, oh my God, where do I start? What issue do I pick, right? Like, who do I talk to about this, right? Who else will be involved? So these are some of the pieces that can help us understand like when we're doing this and we're starting at the brainstorming phase, how do we get to a full out campaign or an idea of what our goal is? So the first piece is defining the issue, right? Understanding what's the problem that we're trying to solve? What is the goal that we're trying to reach? What is the outcome that we would like to see? And then also thinking of like, what do you not want, right? You might be in your advocacy or your campaign, or someone might bring an idea, or maybe you come to an agreement with the school board, but they might propose something that is not what you want. So you have to be really intentional and clear coming into this as a community. This is what we've agreed on. And then also identifying like who's going to be able to give us what we want, right? Who has the decision-making power? If I wanted to get pizza this mosque right now, I would think, who is a person in charge that can get me the pizza? Is it Usman? Is he the one that can do it, right? And if he is, then he's going to be the target of my campaign or my advocacy. And then also thinking of, does this fit the criteria for a worthwhile issue, right? Is it something that we can actually get enough people around? So I'm going to assume that all of you want pizza because we love pizza. Who doesn't like pizza? And I'm going to say that's a worthwhile issue advocating for. Next, you want to be able to define the issue, right? You want to get very specific with what exactly are you trying to address. If an issue is too broad, you might lose people, or you might also not be able to get specific enough to say like, who can get me what I want, right? I might just say like, I want pizza, but I'm going to say I want pizza right now, today in this mosque. Then I can get very clear on what my strategy is going to be. And so being very clear on that, having a set of demands, knowing who the constituents are, right? Who's going to be interested in addressing this issue, who's going to be impacted by this issue, identifying who's the target and who will be able to get to this. And the target is really the person in power, right? The person who holds the ability to make a decision on this. So for example, if I went to the school board and I asked them for something that is really in the control of the state, then the school board would just tell me, well, Haleema, that's a great idea, but unfortunately, we're not the ones that control this. You need to go to the governor. So that's why it's important to also know who's going to be the decision maker so that you can get to the right person and have the right strategy going into this. And then for actually selecting an issue, right? Like there's so many issues in the world that I'm sure all of us want to change and address, but actually coming down to being a specific issue, these are some criteria that you can use, right? You can see, will this issue actually result in a real improvement in the lives of people? Is it something that many people will feel the difference of if it happens? Is it something that will unite people or divide people? And it's okay if it's going to divide people, but that's just something to keep in mind when you're picking your strategy and how you're going to address it. Is it something that you can easily communicate? And there are some issues that are very complicated or hard to communicate, and you can find a way to work around that. But just stuff to take into consideration, right? Is it something that's going to actually shift power, or is it going to keep the power dynamics in the same way? That's a really important one. Is it something that you can win? And there are issues that, we look at, and we look at the history of it and we realize, well, this is a really hard issue and the chances of winning will be less, but also I'll propose this, you can change what a win is. In my opinion, I might not get that outcome, but for me, a win could also be my community came together and said no to this. And that to me was a win, right? So it also depends, like, what is a win for you, or what does your end goal look like? Sometimes our campaigns or advocacy efforts don't have the outcome that we want, but maybe in the process of getting there, we built a strong community, we built a base of people that we can activate later, or maybe we did so much as to raise awareness of the issue, right? Anything that we can do to make progress is a win, and we have to be able to take that in. And then also having a time frame, right? What is a timeline for something? It might be based on the legislative cycle. It might be something that's more pressing or urgent. Typically, budgets get passed for county budgets. So if you're thinking of like Alameda County, which we're in, for local budgets, you would think of like June is a time where a budget is passed. So then we're going to work back from June and think, well, maybe we want $50,000 for the county to allocate money for halal food at schools. And June is the timeline when they pass the budget, so that means I need to start meeting with my county board of supervisors in maybe January. And before January, I need to mobilize my community, so maybe that fall time is when I'm actually getting people together and saying, hey, do we all agree this is an issue? What's our strategy? Who do we want to approach? And then January comes and then I say, let me get a meeting with the board of supervisors, and I show up with my 10, 15 people and say, look, all of us want this. So you want to start thinking of the timeline. And then when we're actually like talking about the issue, right? The way that we talk about an issue matters. The way we frame an issue is really important. I always say this, right? We may not all agree on the same specific thing, but usually we can agree on the same values, right? So if you and I don't see eye to eye on like abolishing the police, we can all agree that community members should feel safe when they're going into their schools. That's a value point. So the way that we frame something does matter. Here, you can also see if people want to fight for something. A lot of times we focus on what we're not for, which is important, but we also have to know, like, what are we for, right? If I'm not for police, what am I for? So that's why you see things like CAIR, not cops. People are saying, I'm for investments in mental health, in education, in youth programs. That's what I'm for. And that's something that, all of us want to get behind something, right? That makes us feel excited. We won't have time for the activity, so I'm just going to move into the second step, which is mapping out who are the players, right? Who's involved? Who are going to be your allies? Who are going to be people who have been working on this issue? You'll be surprised to know, or maybe not surprised, that more often than not, the issue that you've come up with is an issue that somebody else has thought of. And so thinking of who else is working on this issue, what have they done? What can I learn from them? And who's going to be my ally, or who's going to be my base, right? Who can I bring in to support? And then also thinking of, when you're doing the mapping, right? When you're identifying like who this person is, also asking the questions of like, what kind of power and influence do they have? Who do they know, right? Maybe someone here has a direct connection to the president, or through a connection of a connection. I do. I know someone who knows Kamala Harris, right? And so maybe someone would come to me strategically thinking, Haleema can get me here to do this. So you want to start mapping out those pieces. And then also thinking of like, who's going to oppose your campaign, right? Who's going to come and say, absolutely not? And what kind of power and influence do they have? So those are all important pieces to map out. And then you want to understand, who are you targeting, right? Who are you going to bring this to their attention? Is it the mayor? Is it, the school superintendent? Is it the principal? Or in the case of pizza, is it Usman? And what do we know about this person, right? And so doing some research, getting some information, getting some background on the person. Maybe you can see, if it's an elected official, their history of how have they voted in the past, right? Who's endorsed them? Those things will give us all a lot of really great information. I think everyone should have these handouts, right? The target preparation sheet and all of those components, you should have them. And so these kind of give you some great sheets where you can add in and fill in details as you're thinking of like your case study example or your issue, right? And you're mapping out, how do I get to this person? How do I get what I want? So these are places that you want to refer back to when you're doing any kind of social change work, so you can have a very clear strategy going in. And then step 4, which is, now that we've thought about all the things, what are we going to, how are we going to make this happen? So how are we going to mobilize people to show up, right? How are we going to get people to actually know that this is what's happening in the community? Maybe we have a launch party, like a pizza party. We say, hey, come over, we're gonna have pizza and we're gonna talk about this issue. How are you gonna utilize media, right? You mentioned over here, like social media would be a tool that you would use. That's a great tool that all of us are very familiar with. We're lucky to have that, right? People who organized before us did not have social media. So how do we effectively use that tool? And then also thinking of what are the tactics, what are the strategies you're going to use to get there? And there might be points where things escalate. So you met with an elected official, you sat down with them and you said, this is what we need. And that person said, meh, they weren't feeling it. There wasn't enough pressure. So maybe the next time, instead of talking to them directly, since you already tried that, you show up to a meeting with 10 people and you all say, we're raising this during public comment section. Maybe that doesn't work. They just go, I'm not that interested. So maybe next time you show up with signs and it's a rally outside of the meeting. So you're actually escalating, and showing direct action to really challenge that and to make sure that the person that you're targeting is paying attention and you're able to get what you want. So I'll close out with, mapping what our roles are. Now that we've kind of got an idea of social change, we've got an idea of the cycle of oppression, what do we do about this? And what are the roles that we can take? And like I said, each of us have a very unique role and talent that we can play. All of you already shared like additional talents, so I'm already very impressed. And this is a map that was put together by Deepa Iyer. She was one of the people who founded SALT, which was a South Asian organizing group after 9/11. Very cool work to check out. And so she talks about these different kind of roles. And I would love to just have people maybe just in rows read these examples, and if you identify with this, like this is you, raise your hand. So we'll start with weavers. If you want to bring the mic around, maybe we'll start with the last row and just go down. And once you read the role, let's pause and look around and see. And we can all have multiple roles and multiple things we identify with. So just raise your hand if you're like, that's me, I'm a weaver.
Weavers, I see through lines of connectivity between people, places, organizations, ideas, and movements.
Fellow weavers? That's me, definitely me. Pass it down.
Experimenters, I innovate, pioneer, and invent. I take risks and course correct as needed.
Okay, got a couple of those.
Frontline responders, I address community crises by marshaling and organizing resources, networks, and messages.
And we got any of those? A couple of those, nice.
Visionaries, I imagine and generate our boldest possibilities, hopes, and dreams, and remind us of our direction.
Got any inspirational folks? Visionaries, nice. You just pass it down to any row.
Builders, I develop, organize, and implement ideas, practices, people, and resources in service of a collective vision.
That's me. Any other ones? Any other builders?
Caregivers, I nurture and nourish the people around me by creating and sustaining a community of care, joy, and connection.
And caregivers, say anyone who bakes. It can be easily. Just bring food to the movement.
Disruptors, I take uncomfortable and risky actions to shake up the status quo, to raise awareness, and to build power.
Have any disruptors here? This is the Gamechangers Network. Do we have at least one disruptor?
Healers, I recognize and tend to the generational and current traumas caused by oppressive systems, institutions, policies, and practices.
Any healers in the room?
Storytellers, I craft and share our community stories, cultures, experiences, histories, and possibilities through art, music, media, and movement.
Any storytellers? Got a few.
I teach, counsel, and advise using my gifts of well-earned discernment. Thank you. And wisdom.
Any guides? Even if we're young, we can still be guides. So those were all the roles that I had here, I believe. And I think to close out, I would just love to, think of, as you saw kind of the variety of roles that are out there, what roles do you feel like I really enjoy this? There might be some roles too, like what are the roles that people have told you you're really good at that? You're a visionary, like you inspire me. You're a caregiver, right? You're someone who really creates space where I feel like I'm safe here. And so just thinking like, what are you good at? What do you enjoy? What are some of your strengths? And then also like, what do your friends say? Like some of our friends can also give us some really good feedback. Say like, you're really good at helping me with this. So I would just love to have everyone take 1 minute to individually reflect on that. And then just share out, we'll hear from a few people on what came up for you. And also think of this in relation to how we contribute to our community when making social change. So it'll take about 1 minute to do that.
Something that I think my role would be is probably a storyteller, because whenever I usually tell my friends about like a couple of stories of when, I faced injustice being a Muslim or discrimination. And I think that they always tell me that they didn't know about this, like the discrimination that like our community would have to face before I told them the stories. So I think that that's something that I could use as my role in the social justice movement.
Very nice, yes. So a lot of ways to do storytelling, and it's a very powerful way to connect with people, so we can all relate to stories. Let's hear from one more person.
I think I'm more of like a planning stage, but also I am someone who just in general, like if I see something, I'll usually want to join in and help.
Yes, being a supporter and being a planner, that's super important. And part of what makes our movement building and organizing successful is when we have that person in the back who's making sure everything is running smoothly. And even today, right, we have our folks here in the back. You want to both raise your hands, Jeff and Usman, and we have our tech uncle. I don't know where he went, but he's behind the scenes, right? He's making sure everything is running smoothly so that we can be here and do our thing. And so it's important to keep that in mind and recognize that each of us have a role to play. Like I can't stress this enough. Like no matter where you think you are at in life or your skills, your experience, like all of us can do something. And so it's important for us to take that as a moral imperative, that it's our responsibility as Muslims, as people on this planet, to look out for our community, right? The Prophet never went home and said, I'm going to go to sleep and not think about my neighbor. He was thinking of a 40 house radius around him and said, if these people are not cool, I can't go to sleep. And that's a very high level, high standard, right? I don't think I'm there, but that's something that we should aspire to go to, right? That we should be the type of people that know our neighbors, that check on them, that make sure people in our community are okay. It might seem daunting to think of like, oh my God, how am I going to change the world and all these big issues? But if you start local, start in your own house, start with your family, start with your friends, start with your neighborhood. That's where we can all make a difference. And you may not even realize that just you showing up, has made someone feel better, or just you saying something or acknowledging this happened, right? That can make someone feel seen, and we may not even realize that sometimes. So it's important that we always speak up, that we always act however we can, right? Because each of us have, as we all just saw, different roles to play. Not all of us are going to be standing at the front and doing this, and we're not all needed to do that, right? There's all these different roles. So I would just encourage all of you to think of that. And, closing out with just thinking of solidarity. This is the South Asians for Black Lives Instagram if you want to pull out your phones and follow. There's usually a lot of good educational content on there, so it's just a very easy way to get kind of day-to-day information about how do we continue to unlearn and address anti-racism, address anti-Blackness and all these issues. Something that I'm personally still working on. I think it's a lifelong journey because we live in a society that is very entrenched by white supremacy, that is very entrenched by racism, Islamophobia, like all the isms, right? And so every time we're outside interacting with mainstream society, those are the things that we're breathing in. They're subtle, but we're taking them in, right? Whether it's an ad that we saw on our phone, or it's a movie or a TV show that we just watched, or it's the words that someone used, right? These are all things that embody white supremacy in very subtle ways, and they become normalized and internalized. And so one of the biggest things we can do is to be people who are conscious of this, right? We may not be able to change everything, but if I can think, oh, somebody used this word and that word perpetuated racism, right? One example is people say, I'm the black sheep of the family. Why are we associating the word black with negativity? We see that black cat, bad luck. So I'm noticing that, right? I may not be able to change how other people talk, but I can be aware of it, and maybe I can point it out in a conversation with a friend. So it's important for us to continue to do that work every day. It's not easy, but we have to do it. And so we'll close out with just thinking of like, now that we've gone through this, you know, what does solidarity mean to you? And what are you walking away from, right? This is, I hope you didn't feel like I was just talking at you. Like, this is really something that I feel like we as a community have a responsibility to do as people of the Qur'an, of people who are God-conscious people, right? This is something that's our responsibility. So I hope this feels relevant to you. And I would love to just kind of close out with thinking of what does solidarity mean to you, and like what's something that you're taking out from this session today. So we'll take about a minute to do some self-reflection, and then we'll do some sharebacks.
I think after today especially, I think it's important to just be mindful of like any prejudice that you see anytime, and like spreading awareness as much as you can.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Something that we can do every day.
I think something I'm taking away is that you can come up with a lot of solutions, whether it's educating yourself, or like going to people like teachers and students and finding other, like hearing out other people's point of view.
Yes, there's lots of avenues for change making.
Solidarity is deciding to separate yourself from the systems that you're born into and that you're acclimated to in order to stand up for beliefs and principles.
Very well said. So I want to thank you all for participating. I know, it's Sunday morning, but, I think this is just really important for us all to know. As we navigate our community as young adults, when you go to college, these things will come in really handy because, unfortunately, a lot of colleges have different kinds of institutional oppression that we will probably end up working on. So these are all just really important skills. You can kind of check out the South Asians for Black Lives Instagram and Twitter if you want more information. And then if you have any questions, you can definitely reach out to me. My Instagram is just my full name, Haleema Bharoocha. And then I can also share my email with Usman if there's any follow-up. But, happy to brainstorm with you guys, or if you're thinking of this as like something that you're passionate about, right, as a career. There are a lot of jobs in organizing, advocacy, education, self-help, direct service. And so these are all very viable careers that all of you can pursue if you're interested, or also just really great volunteer opportunities. So I will leave you all with that.